Welcome to the debate. Today we are examining one of the most violent and controversial chapters in all of American labor history, the Colorado labor wars of 1903 and 1904. This period saw just profound and often lethal conflict between the Western Federation of Miners, or the WFM, and these very powerful employer associations. I mean, the sheer systematic nature of the violence deployed here is remarkable. Historians have really singled this out as an episode where repression was used as strategically by employers as in any other labor conflict in American history.
It was an absolutely devastating struggle. It was marked by martial law, the systematic suspension of civil authority, and really the total collapse of the rule of law across districts like Cripple Creek and Telluride.
Right. And our central disagreement today really centers on the origin of that systematic violence and repression. Was the destruction of the WFM primarily a result of the union's own radical shift toward militant industrial unionism and, specific acts of violence, which then escalated the conflict to a point that it sort of necessitated a powerful systemic state response?
Or conversely, was the violence primarily the product of a deliberate, coordinated, and state-sanctioned campaign of repression? A campaign of extra-legal violence orchestrated by anti-union forces, using the power of the government itself as a tool of private capital just to eliminate labor's influence. I'll be arguing that the primary force here was the systematic top-down anti-union violence and the legal abuses carried out by the state government, really acting in the interests of the mine owners.
And I'll be contending that the WFM's embrace of class warfare and their increasingly militant, disruptive tactics were the primary instigators. The sheer scale of their ideological challenge made a measured response almost impossible and, in a way, compelled the state and the employers toward that harsh reaction we saw. The shift in the WFM's philosophy was fundamental. It moved well beyond traditional collective bargaining. They redefined their goals, openly calling for a complete revolution of social and economic conditions and the outright abolition of the wage system. So you see, this wasn't just a request for higher pay or safer conditions. It was a declared class war against the underlying structures of private property and capitalism itself. This embrace of industrial unionism, organizing all workers within an industry, regardless of their skill, meant that the WFM started employing what you could almost call hostage-taking strike tactics. For instance, in August 1903, the WFM struck 50 mines in Cripple Creek that had no direct dispute with their employees. They did this solely to pressure outside mill operators in Colorado City who refused to recognize the union. This action, it demonstrates a willingness to paralyze an entire local economy for a broader ideological objective, creating an atmosphere of economic crisis that seemed, to them at least, to justify an aggressive state intervention.
I come at it from a different way, which focuses more on the institutional actors and their intent. The state's behavior demonstrates that this was less a necessary reaction to militancy and more a carefully orchestrated campaign to eliminate labor influence altogether. The evidence strongly suggests that the state government was acting explicitly as a tool of private capital. Governor Peabody, who campaigned on a promise to ensure safe investments, appointed explicitly anti-union figures to key positions. And that includes General Sherman Bell, who was a former mine manager. The conflict of interest was just massive. General Bell was not only the head of the National Guard, but he was also reportedly paid an annual salary of $3,200, which was a substantial sum for the era, directly by the mine owners' associations. So this military structure, financially beholden to the employers, then systematically dismantled civil authority and due process. Bell himself reportedly stated to hell with the Constitution, which, that became the operational mandate for the National Guard as they suspended the Bill of Rights, engaging in widespread illegal acts like mass deportations and the imprisonment of civil officials.
Okay, let's focus on the actual lethal violence committed during this period. How can we possibly dismiss the WFM's direct responsibility for the worst acts of terror when a known WFM member, Harry Orchard, confessed to the Independence Depot bombing that killed 13 non-union men? Orchard was explicit. He stated under oath that he was paid by union leadership, including prominent figures like Bill Haywood and Charles Moyer. And what's more, His account of the methods was corroborated by physical evidence. I mean, shattered pistols were found at both the Independence Depot explosion site and the Vindicator mine, where 2 management employees were killed earlier. This lends real credence to his confession that he used a pistol mechanism as a triggering device for the dynamite. When the Union, through its members and seemingly its leadership, engages in systematic sabotage that results in mass murder, it fundamentally shifts the burden of instigation away from the state and squarely onto the Union.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. I don't buy that the confession provides definitive proof of WFM leadership's culpability. Orchard was a deeply unreliable witness. I mean, he was a known criminal, a bigamist, an arsonist, a thief, who confessed only under extraordinary pressure from the Pinkerton detective James McParland. And McParland was a notoriously ruthless figure who threatened Orchard with immediate execution. He only offered the possibility of freedom and financial reward if he implicated WFM leaders in this sweeping conspiracy. We also have to recognize that Orchard later admitted to having served as a paid Pinkerton informant during the strike. So this makes his testimony, which was procured under duress and promise of reward by anti-union forces, highly, highly suspect. The evidence surrounding the Independence Depot explosion itself it's just highly conflicting. There is testimony that the Mine Owners Association had plotted the explosion, and specific accounts mention that the intention was to use the event for maximum propaganda benefit.
While the credibility of a single confessor can always be questioned, the fact remains that...
And it's not just that. The evidence of bloodhounds tracking the bomber's scent away from the Union Hall and toward anti-union figures, like Detective Benamore's house, along with sworn affidavits detailing planned provocations, like Major Ellison's testimony about National Guard leaders planning to shoot up the Vindicator's shaft house themselves, that seriously undermines the narrative that the Union was solely responsible for the conflict's worst violence. The anti-Union forces had the motive and the means to commit the sabotage, and then scapegoat the WFM. That's a crucial point regarding the lack of accountability for the violence, but the systemic and public violence carried out by state authorities that fundamentally differentiates this conflict from a simple industrial dispute.
You mentioned General Bell's $3,200 annual pay from the mine owners. That is a textbook case of corruption.
This financial dependency fueled a military command structure that openly violated the state constitution, which clearly states that the military shall always be in strict subordination to the civil power. When Judge W.P. Seeds, a civil authority, ruled in favor of the detained miners seeking habeas corpus, their fundamental right to challenge illegal detention, General Bell responded by saying, "Habeas corpus be damned, we'll give them post-mortems." This wasn't just rhetoric. The National Guard deployed infantry with fixed bayonets to surround the courthouse, preventing the court from conducting its constitutional duty. Suspending habeas corpus meant minors were held indefinitely, sometimes in these bullpens, these makeshift prisons, where they faced kangaroo courts and were judged guilty simply for refusing to sign a document renouncing the WFM. This is not law enforcement. This is using the state apparatus for extrajudicial union elimination.
I see why you emphasize the shocking illegality of Bell's actions and the deplorable abuses of civil power. And look, I do not minimize the gravity of ignoring habeas corpus or the profound conflict of interest presented by Bell's supplemental pay. But the state's primary motivation for the intervention was the restoration of order against a massive threat, a threat that local authorities admitted they could not handle. Governor Peabody only sent the National Guard after local civil authorities, like the El Paso County Sheriff, repeatedly requested troops due to the perceived threat of widespread violence and property destruction. An independent investigative commission concluded that a, quote, reign of terror genuinely existed in the Cripple Creek district. So while the methods employed by Bell were excessive and abusive, yes, the governmental goal was to restore the functioning economic and social order that the WFM's militant, revolutionary, and disruptive tactics had shattered. I mean, they had already lost major strikes elsewhere, and their desperation to hold Cripple Creek hostage really forced the state's hand.
When a union explicitly declares its intention is to abolish the wage system, the state views that organization not as an economic partner, but as an insurgency. Let's discuss the political and economic motivation driving the anti-union resolve. The mine owners and Governor Peabody viewed the WFM's core objectives, industrial unionism and the abolition of the wage system, as a truly existential threat to private property rights. The owners were resolved to fight the union's power on principle, believing that any concession, especially to a radical union, was a weakness that would just lead to further chaos. And further hardening this conflict was the political crisis around the 8-hour-day law. Despite a constitutional amendment passing with a staggering 72% voter approval, the Republican legislature and Governor Peabody refused to enact the law. This unwillingness to compromise on the fundamental issue of labor control, even when facing a clear popular mandate, signaled to the WFM that the only path forward was total confrontation, and the owners were equally prepared to offer it, viewing the union's power as fundamentally illegitimate.
That's a compelling argument about the owner's ideological theory of revolution. But have you considered that the state's refusal to honor the constitutional mandate for the 8-hour day was itself the core provocation? The state's failure to respect a popular referendum. A 72% vote is undeniable, created a democratic vacuum that left the WFM with absolutely no legal recourse. This failure fundamentally legitimized the WFM's escalation and provided moral justification for radical tactics. And what's more, the activities of clandestine groups like the Citizens Alliance, which operated in deep secrecy and actively worked to prevent amicable settlements, reveal the true intent. Their goal was not just to win the strike, but to break the union completely. The systematic nature of the repression, the fact they arrested and deported over 230 men, loading them onto trains and dumping them at the state line simply because they refused to renounce the WFM, that shows this was not about addressing specific militant acts or restoring order. It was a class war of elimination, utilizing the state's violence and legal mechanisms to terminate all WFM influence in the region.
Ultimately, the WFM's radical ideological platform and their subsequent decision to escalate labor tactics into revolutionary action, holding an entire industrial district hostage for the sake of organizing outside workers, provided the powerful forces of capital and the state with the necessary grounds for a total reaction. While the state's response was, yes, undeniably marked by gross abuses of civil power and corruption, the WFM's initial decision to define the conflict as existential class warfare ensured that the ensuing struggle would be fought to the bitter end, resulting in their systematic destruction.
I think intellectual disagreement sharpens understanding. And what is clear here is that the anti-union forces and the state government committed systematic, coordinated violence and legal overreach that goes far beyond a justifiable restoration of order. They employed agents provocateurs, financially incentivized military commanders, suspended the most basic rights like habeas corpus, and suppressed the local press. This systematic anti-union violence, implemented through the machinery of the state, treated the conflict not as a law enforcement issue, but as a political campaign aimed at the complete elimination of labor power, and that set a dangerous and troubling precedent for American civil liberties.
It is a complex historical record, absolutely, defined by the collision of radical labor ideology and uncompromising corporate power. I think we have to acknowledge the difficulty of assigning singular blame for the devastation when both sides committed such grave acts.
Indeed, the extent to which institutional power was systematically abused by those who swore to uphold the law, that remains the conflict's most defining characteristic, and it urges us to continue exploring the full historical record of this devastating chapter in Colorado's labor history.